Over the last few lessons, what we have been doing is spending quite a lot of time talking about the Conservatives in power during the 1950s in this period of the sort of so-called affluent society, stretching all the way up until the Labour victory in 1964. But what we've not spent that much time exploring is the position of the Labour Party during this time period. Because the Labour Party, of course, exists, they lose in 1951 after the failure of Clement Attlee to maintain government. And really, they have a number of factional rivalries and real major issues associated with their leadership at the time that makes it very difficult for them to win re-election in any meaningful sense. But that's not to suggest that if they got their act together, they would have won, because the Conservatives were very, very popular during this time period, just because of the sort of the growing affluence that was coming after the end of the Second World War. So what we're going to do in this video is spend some time essentially looking at the period of 1951 to 1964 and thinking about the internal Labour divisions that existed in that regard. And the first point that should be noted is that Hugh Gaitskell really takes the office after Labour's defeat in 1951. He introduced, in fact, as Chancellor in 1951, prescription charges for the NHS to help fund the rearmament in Korea. This triggers a major rupture, the first major rupture within the broader part of the Labour Party. The first rupture is between Norrin Bevan, the NHS architect, who resigned from his post in protest of this new change, launching the Bevanite faction, which was, of course, opposed to things such as prescription charges, because they saw it as a betrayal of the socialist principles. And so that's what we get in 1951. Broadly speaking, this starts to then create the emergence of two camps. You have the orthodox socialists, the Bevanite camp, which is of course committed to public ownership and unilateral disarmament, versus the revisionist camp, the Gaitskellites, led by Hugh Gaitskell, which advocated for more pragmatism in terms of their politics and also to try and gain electoral appeal, that was seen as more important to them. And so between 1953 and 1955, we see a number of issues taking place. We see, of course, that Bevan resigns from the Shadow Cabinet in 1954 after disagreements over British support for Citations, sharply intensifying the tensions with Gaitskell. A contest for party treasurer in 1954 pitted Bevan directly against a Gaitskellite rival. Gaitskell won convincingly. Bevan described the party leadership as a dissented, calculated machine, an epithet often attributed to Gaitskell, probably incorrectly. This is what we start to see in the early 1950s, and ultimately we start to then think about, when we get to the mid-1950s, there are various different factional realignments taking place within the Labour Party. So Labour in the mid-1950s, we see, for example, in 1955, Jim Griffiths, part of a sort of non-aligned group who wasn't really particularly Bevanite or Gaitskellite in any meaningful sense, would, in the deputy leadership contest, beat Norrin Bevan, but Bevan still remains a very influential figure, and is elected the party treasurer again in 1956, and then appointed the shadow foreign secretary after the Suez Crisis, showing that factional lines fluctuated over time fundamentally. We then start to see a minor reconciliation between the two sides of the Labour Party in 1957, when Bevan and Gaitskell temporarily reconciled, with both of them endorsing the 1957 Industry and Society document, which basically limited new nationalisation proposals. But this doesn't last very long at all, because the ideological showdown really starts to take effect in 1959. Labour's 1959 election defeat catalysed ideological showdowns. Gaitskell blamed the Bevanites promoted manifesto, which called for various different things such as the higher taxes and expanding benefits, he blamed that part of the manifesto for losing the support of the middle class, while the left portrayed Gaitskell as abandoning the socialist commitments. All of this brings us to a conference in Blackpool in 1959, the 1959 Blackpool Conference. And it was here that Gaitskell proposed scrapping Clause 4. Now, Clause 4 was the Labour Party's commitment to public ownership. So the sort of Labour Party manifesto, if you will, or the Labour Party constitution, if you will. Clause 4 of that document suggested that, or made a very public pledge and a public commitment to public ownership. And Gaitskell proposed scrapping this motion. Now, as we've already seen, people like Bevan and Orrin Bevan would resign over issues that didn't align in his belief with socialist commitments and socialist values. So something like scrapping a party's commitment to public ownership, which was seen as one of the sort of bedrock foundational features of British socialism, was going to cause problems. Rejecting the motion, delegates reaffirmed nationalisation. It was a rejected motion, and it intensified the split between various different factions. In fact, it promoted the Gaitskellites to form the Campaign for Democratic Socialism in October 1960 to organise moderate forces efficiently. So it almost caused a complete split in the party itself. And this isn't really where the splits end. There are further splits over the debates about nuclear disarmament. In 1960, in the 1960 Scarborough Conference, the issue of nuclear policy was brought to the fore. Gaitskell vowed to essentially fight to save the party we love and voted in favour of unilateral disarmament, which was a core Bevanite position. So he tried to be pragmatic about it. But this was Gaitskell himself, Hugh Gaitskell himself, and in response to this, Gaitskell essentially mobilised to the Gaitskell-aligned group, the Campaign for Democratic Socialism, mobilised to reverse unilateralism. And at the 1961 conference in Blackpool, they succeeded in reinstating the NATO-aligned policy via the Policy for Peace. This was a resolution which would reverse the unilateralist mandate, the mandate for unilateral disarmament. So Gaitskell, essentially, as a sort of basic summary of this whole debacle, Gaitskell was trying to be more pragmatic, was trying to maintain alliances within the Labour Party between Bevanites and Gaitskellites, and so he voted in favour to essentially allow for unilateral disarmament, which was a core Bevanite position. But in response to this, in response for the vote to have unilateral disarmament, the Campaign for Democratic Socialism, which was a Gaitskellite-aligned group, mobilised to reverse it. And so at the 1961 conference in Blackpool, they succeeded by reinstating the NATO-aligned defence policy, which was known as the Policy for Peace Resolution, which reversed any kind of policy to try and favour unilateral disarmament of nuclear weapons. I know it's very complicated. I know it's very confusing. That's because very tedious debates about sort of moderate socialism versus more expansionist socialism and debates between Labour politicians, it does get very tedious in the 1950s and the 1960s. But basically, the battle over nuclear disarmament really exposes the tensions over party democracy versus the authority of the leadership, because you have the supporters of Hugh Gaitskell condemning the left leaders for defying what is known as the PLP whip, even expelling some members of Parliament from the Parliamentary Labour group for dissenting from that particular decision. Things are not rosy in the 1960 elections as well, 1960 leadership election specifically, and also the 1963 leadership election too. So in the 1960 leadership election, we see the emergence of Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson was a Labour politician who was aligned to the left, but he was not in support of unilateral disarmament. So even though unilateral disarmament was a left of the Labour Party policy, he was not aligned to that. He was an anti-unilateralist, but he was still aligned to the sort of Bevanite faction. He challenged Gaitskell for the leadership, and he earned himself 32.8% of the Parliamentary Labour Party vote, the PLP vote, which ultimately means he lost decisively. He lost 166 to 81. However, his chance would emerge again because in early 1963, Hugh Gaitskell would die. He dies, I believe, unexpectedly. It's not a thing that anybody expected to happen. And so we see another leadership election taking place that same year, which does see Wilson emerge as the compromise leader of the broader Labour movement. Potentially his sort of Bevanite-aligned policies mixed with his anti-unilateralist stance provided a situation in which he was able to sort of cross the foray and to be able to unite the more pragmatic with the more left-wing side of the Labour Party. A split right-wing vote between George Brown and James Callaghan essentially allows Wilson to win the second round of the PLP vote with 58%. And so fundamentally, we then start to see a transition after he takes leadership. He positions himself as a unifier. Although he is deeply rooted in the Bevanite tradition, he is distancing himself from unilateralism and also the excesses of a nationalisation. So being overly vigorous, shall we say, in terms of policies of nationalisation. We also start to see that there is general apathy towards the Conservatives during this time. Bear in mind, during this whole period, we've gone from 1951 all the way to 1963, and the Conservatives have won and won and won and won, and it was 13 years in opposition that the Labour Party was in. And so by the time the 1964 general election comes around, people are starting to want to see change. They're going to start to want to see change in direction. And so we get a Labour victory, a Wilson victory in the 1964 election, marking a closing chapter on the overt factional conflict that exists within the Labour Party, and also it marks a closing chapter of 13 years of Conservative governance, all of which we will get to in future lessons' time when we start thinking about the period of the 1960s.